You know the story. A shepherd boy, a sling, a single stone, and a giant named Goliath brought to his knees. It is one of the most iconic moments in the Bible. But what if I told you that was never the end of the story? That what followed after Goliath's fall was something far more terrifying. A quiet war, a blood feud, a line of giants who did not die with him. They were not myths. They were his brothers, and they wanted revenge. Most believers never hear their names, never learn their weapons, never understand the reason they rose after Goliath fell. But they are there, hidden in the seams of Scripture. 5 brothers, 5 shadows of a fallen titan, each one more than just a warrior, each one a living symbol of something darker, more ancient, and more dangerous. Why does the Bible preserve their stories in fragments? Why did David's men tremble not after the first victory, but after the last confrontation? And why did they beg their king not to fight again? Was it just fear? Or was there something about these giants, something the Israelites understood, that we have forgotten? This is not just about Goliath. This is about bloodlines, about the spiritual weight of corrupted strength, about the giants that still return in different forms, and about the lamp of Israel that must never go out. Because this story is more than ancient history. It is a warning, a pattern, and if you look closely, you might find that these giants are still standing, still watching, still waiting. Let us begin where most sermons end, not with the stone, but with the brothers, the forgotten race, who were the Rephaim. Buried deep in the folds of Scripture is a name that flickers like a shadow across the pages. Rephaim. It is a name spoken without explanation, appearing in the margins of battles and bloodlines, lingering like a ghost from a forgotten war. To many, Goliath was simply a tall man, a singular enemy. But the Bible hints at something far older, a race, a remnant, a people whose very existence challenged the order of heaven. The Rephaim were not merely large in size, they were large in consequence. Their name is rooted in a word that can mean giants, but also the dead, the shades, the ones beneath. And that is not coincidence. These beings carried with them a spiritual heaviness, as if they belonged more to the underworld than the earth. They were known to dwell in Bashan, a place whose name means place of fertile soil, but whose spiritual reputation was anything but fertile. Bashan was a stronghold of resistance, a land saturated with ancient rebellion. It was the home of Og, king of the Rephaim, whose massive iron bed was a testament to the monstrous size of his frame. But more than that, it was a throne of defiance against God's dominion. When Moses conquered Og, the Bible records it not as a military victory alone, but as a necessary clearing of spiritual space. The conquest of Canaan was not just about land. It was about purging the land of distorted power. The Rephaim were a defiled echo of the divine image, enlarged in flesh, but empty in spirit. Their survival after the flood is still a matter of mystery. Some say they were remnants. Others say they were born again through corrupted unions. Whatever the case, they were not supposed to be there, and yet they were. But while Israel cut down many of them, some escaped. They fled to the coastlines, to the edges of Israel's reach, to places like Gath, places where the soil still remembered the footsteps of giants. And from those strongholds, a new generation of giants emerged, not just Goliath, but a family of giants, bound by blood, bound by vengeance, because evil does not vanish, it hides and waits. Blood feud, the vow of vengeance after Goliath's death. When David stood before Goliath, sling in hand, he wasn't just confronting a warrior. He was standing against a legacy, against a bloodline that stretched back to the ancient rebellion. And when the stone sank into Goliath's forehead, it did more than end a life. It shattered the illusion of invincibility that had cloaked his kind for generations. But blood cries out when it is spilled, and Goliath's fall did not bring silence. It awakened something. The Bible whispers of 5 others, brothers, kin, bound not only by family, but by a covenant of vengeance. They were not drawn to the battlefield for honor. They came for blood, to avenge the disgrace of their fallen giant. And so began a series of battles that most believers never notice. Tucked within the chapters of Samuel and Chronicles are the accounts of these confrontations. Giants rising one after another, each one seeking to extinguish the light that had humiliated them. The light of Israel, the line of David. In one of those battles, David grows weary. The shepherd who once ran to the fight now stumbles under its weight. The text says he grew faint. And at that moment, one of Goliath's kin, Ishbi-Benob, saw his chance. He lifted a massive spear, its bronze tip weighing hundreds of shekels. But before he could strike Abishai, the son of Zeruiah intercepted. He killed the giant and saved David's life. After that moment, David's men made a solemn request. Do not go out to battle again. Do not risk the lamp of Israel. That phrase is not symbolic. It is prophetic. David was more than a king. He was the bearer of a promise, a living root from which the Messiah would one day bloom, and the giants knew. If they could crush the lamp, they could darken the world. So the war shifted. It moved into the hands of David's mighty men. One by one, they faced the remaining brothers. Not in public duels, but in strategic ambushes. And with each death, the echo of the first stone in the valley of Elah rang louder. But even as the giants fell, their presence revealed something haunting, that behind every visible enemy, there is a deeper inheritance. And sometimes what we fight is not just a man. It is a memory, a bloodline, a rebellion waiting to rise again. And rise they did, bearing names, weapons, and deformities that pointed to something more than strength. They pointed to corruption itself taking form. And their stories were not just ancient records, they were warnings. Warnings written in bone. The 5 brothers of Goliath, names, weapons, and shadows. The fall of Goliath was never the end. It was the trigger. What came after him were not just larger men with swords. They were symbols. Each one embodied something deeper, darker, and more spiritually confrontational. They were not random warriors. They were a bloodline of rebellion preserved in shadow, waiting for their moment to rise. The first was Lami. His name is preserved in 1 Chronicles 20. His spear is described as massive, like the beam of a weaver's loom. That same strange phrase was used to describe Goliath's weapon, suggesting not just size, but legacy. Lami was a mirror of his fallen brother, a man forged in the same mold. He did not come to make peace. He came to re-establish the myth, to prove that Goliath's death was a fluke. But Elhanan, a warrior of Israel, struck him down. And with that blow, the myth began to shatter further. Lami's fall was not just the end of a warrior. It was the breaking of repetition, the refusal to let history repeat itself. Then came Ishbi-Benob, perhaps the most dangerous. He did what Goliath never could. He brought David to the edge of death. Scripture says his spearhead alone weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and he carried a new sword, one that shimmered with deadly purpose. He ambushed David when the king was weary. when the oil ran low, when the fight had worn him thin, it was Abishai who saved him. A man who understood that giants do not strike at strength, they strike at weakness. Ishbi-Benob was not just a warrior. He was a strategy, a spirit that waits until weariness opens a door. And his defeat was not just a rescue, it was a revelation. Even the anointed grow faint, and even kings need covering. Saph followed. His story is short in words but deep in meaning. His name likely means threshold or border. He was slain by Sibbecai the Hushathite. But what he represents is chilling. He was the giant who stood at the edge, at the place between survival and inheritance, between wilderness and promise. Saph was the guardian of delay, the spirit that keeps you on the edge of breakthrough, but never lets you cross. When he fell, it was more than a death. It was the removal of a barrier. Then, another giant appears, and this time, the confusion deepens. He is also named Goliath. Goliath, the Gittite. Was this a relative, a son, a title? We cannot say for sure. But what we do know is that he bore the same name and the same weapon. A spear like a weaver's beam. It is as if the identity of the first Goliath was being worn again. Recycled, reanimated. A haunting reminder that evil often returns wearing familiar faces. That what you thought you defeated may try to come back under a different name. Elhanan struck him down, and in doing so proved that no title is eternal, that names of fear can be unmade. And finally, the nameless giant, the most disturbing of all. He had 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits, a body deformed by excess, a creature exaggerated beyond nature. He is described without a name, as if even Scripture refuses to give him identity. He was not just a giant, he was a distortion, a monument to imbalance, to the unnatural result of unchecked pride. And yet it was not David who fought him. It was Jonathan, the son of David's brother, a next-generation warrior who understood that some giants belong to the battles we pass down, that some victories must be secured by those who come after us. Each of these giants bore something symbolic, a weight that went beyond weapons. They were not just enemies of Israel. They were manifestations of spiritual patterns, imitation, ambush, delay, return, deformity. These were not just battles, they were revelations. And as the last brother fell, so did the illusion that Goliath was ever alone. Because evil rarely travels without a family, and darkness often moves in generations. The legacy of giants, why this matters now. To most, the giants of the Bible are relics of ancient war, strange footnotes in sacred history. But in truth, they were never meant to be forgotten. Their bones may be buried, their names half erased, but the forces they embodied still stand. Not in flesh, but in pattern. Not in armor, but in influence. Their legacy was not in blood alone. It was in what they represented, what they resisted, and what they still tried to prevent. Each brother of Goliath was not merely a warrior. He was a gatekeeper of something unspoken. Lami carried the weapon of imitation, bearing the same spear as Goliath, trying to resurrect a fear that had already been broken. Ishbi-Benob struck when David was weary, proving that even anointed strength has seasons of vulnerability. Saph stood at the border, the threshold giant guarding the line between promise and possession. Goliath, the Gittite, bore the name of fear, itself showing that old threats often return with new masks. And the 6-fingered giant, grotesque and unnamed, was the embodiment of unnatural growth of corruption, unrestrained, a creature swollen beyond design. And so these giants did not just fight Israel. They fought time. They fought inheritance. They fought the unfolding of covenant. And though they died by sword and stone, their shadows linger. Because giants do not always look like giants. Today, they take the form of spiritual fatigue, of compromise dressed as wisdom, of fear that mimics memory, of generational wounds that masquerade as identity. They still stand at the edge of promise, whispering that you will never enter what God declared was yours. But Scripture reveals something profound. The giants fell not because of one man, but because of a people who remembered who they were. David began the battle, but others finished it. Elhanan, Abishai, Jonathan, mighty men, sons, brothers, carriers of covenant. They picked up the fight not for glory, but for light, to keep the lamp burning, to ensure that what was promised would not die in the shadow of what once ruled. This matters now because the same pattern still unfolds. Before every great transition, giants rise, not to test your strength, to test your memory, to ask if you still remember who your God is, if you still believe the land is yours, if you still carry the flame. And that is why the story of these giants must be remembered, not because of how tall they stood, but because of how far they fell and who stood after them. Because when giants rise, they are not only announcing a battle, they are announcing that something holy is near, something worth stopping, something worth guarding, something worth fighting for. And that is where the story turns, not to the past, but to the promise, not to the sword, but to the lamp, still burning, still waiting, still untouchable. The giants may be gone, but the ground remembers. The valleys where they fell still echo with the silence of what could have been. And somewhere in the memory of Scripture, they continue to teach us. Not as monsters of flesh, but as mirrors. Reminders that the battles we face are not always new. They are old battles, ancient shadows returning in new forms to test what has always mattered most. Not our strength, but our covenant. Not the size of our enemy, but the endurance of our light. The story of Goliath's brothers is not just a tale of vengeance. It is a revelation that even after a giant falls, others may rise. Not to undo the victory, but to test its roots, to see if what we killed with a stone can rise again in our silence, in our fatigue, in our forgetfulness. But the lamp of Israel did not go out, and neither should yours, because every generation of darkness is met with a generation of light. Every rising shadow is answered by a deeper flame. And if you're listening to this now, perhaps that light is yours to carry. So reflect, which giant stood in your way? Which one still speaks from behind your past? And who stood beside you when you were too faint to fight? These are the questions that carry the story forward. These are the moments that tell us we are not done yet. If this journey into the forgotten bloodline of giants stirred something in you, share it. Like this video if you believe these truths matter. Subscribe to stay close to this sacred conversation and leave your reflections in the comments. Tell us which brother of Goliath you think still walks among us today, and how you have seen the lamp burn in the dark. Because sometimes the mystery is not in what we uncover, it is in what we remember, and in what we choose to keep burning.